They launched the strike at midnight. Quiet skies turned into fire, and the world braced for chaos. It was supposed to be a show of strength, a message of dominance. But what happened next, no one expected. Because this isn't just about missiles. It's about message. It's about nations that were supposed to bow, but stood taller instead. It's about Iran. It's about Lebanon. And it's about a region that refused to be broken. If you think this is just another headline in a long list of conflicts, think again. What unfolded after that midnight strike didn't just shift the battlefield. It shook the global narrative. Stay with me till the very end, because this story isn't about destruction. It's about defiance. It's not about who struck first. It's about who still stood after. And trust me, by the time this video ends, you'll never look at this region the same way again. When Israel launched its midnight strike, it was more than just a military maneuver. It was a message meant to assert dominance, to shake confidence, and to send fear rippling across borders. It was calculated, deliberate, and aimed at reminding the region who holds the upper hand. In the dark of night, when most people were asleep, the sky lit up not with stars, but with fire. The kind of fire that carries warnings. The kind that says, "We are watching you. Don't move." But what Israel didn't expect was who else was watching. Because while the strike was meant to shock, to paralyze, and to impose control, it ended up waking giants that were never sleeping to begin with. Iran didn't see missiles. It saw patterns. Lebanon didn't hear explosions. It heard a call. That strike, loud as it was, stirred something deeper than panic. It stirred memory. It stirred resistance. It reminded the region of what they've endured and what they've survived. And most of all, it reminded them that the war wasn't just about weapons. It was about identity, pride, and the right to stand without chains. The world saw it as just another headline, another clash in the endless cycle of conflict. But those closest to the fire knew this wasn't routine, this was provocation. And when you provoke people who have already buried sons, rebuilt cities, and walked through decades of hardship, you don't get silence in return, you get clarity. Israel thought it could send a message and move on. But what it didn't realize was that its message wasn't being read in fear, it was being translated into resolve. Because Iran and Lebanon didn't just see an attack, they saw an opportunity to remind the world that they are not pawns in someone else's game, that they won't be caged or cornered, that the night may be long, but they are not afraid of the dark. The giants didn't wake up. They were already awake, watching, waiting. And when the dust from that strike began to settle, it wasn't fear that filled the air. It was anticipation. Because now the world would see what happens when people stop absorbing blows and start answering with dignity. This wasn't the kind of shock Israel anticipated. It wasn't about who fired first. It became about who stood firmer, who responded not with rage, but with reason, who chose not chaos, but control. And in that calm, in that readiness, in that unshaken stance, the world saw something it didn't expect. It saw that courage doesn't sleep. And sometimes the real giants move in silence until they're called to speak. When Israel launched its strike, the world turned to Iran, expecting an instant response. Fire for fire, sound for sound. But Iran didn't move the way its enemies hoped. It didn't rush into retaliation. It didn't unleash chaos. Instead, it did something far more unsettling for those who hoped to provoke it. It waited. That silence wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. Iran wasn't paralyzed, it was processing. It was measuring not just what had been done, but what it meant. And more importantly, it was deciding what kind of answer would echo the loudest. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't the fastest. Sometimes it's the one that comes after thought, not emotion. This wasn't weakness, it was discipline. In a world used to reactionary politics where nations strike back just to show they can, Iran chose patience. It chose control. And that kind of control unsettles its enemies far more than missiles ever could. Because when a nation holds its fire, it holds the narrative. It owns the next move, and that move, when it finally comes, doesn't just hit, it resonates. Iran has learned through decades of pressure and provocation that power isn't always in the blow, but in the buildup. That sometimes the real war isn't just in the skies, but in the minds of those watching. And in that waiting, Iran reminded the world of its most dangerous weapon, strategic restraint. While media outlets speculated, while enemies mocked the silence, and while allies braced for impact, Iran remained composed, not because it lacked the ability to respond, but because it understood the weight of timing. Time can turn a counterattack into a statement, and Iran's statement was clear. We are not your puppet. We don't move when you say move. We move when we decide the cost is right. And the message is undeniable. That kind of power, power over your own response, is a kind of sovereignty that even the most advanced militaries fear. That moment of calm after the strike wasn't peace. It was poise. It was the kind of stillness you see in a fighter who knows his strength, who doesn't need to swing wildly to prove he's dangerous. It was the kind of control that comes from experience, from having been through war, through betrayal, through hardship, and still standing. Iran wasn't ignoring the blow. It was absorbing it, studying it, and crafting a reply that would speak volumes without needing to shout. Because the most effective response is not the one that shocks your enemy. It's the one that exposes them. And in holding back, Iran did just that. It revealed who was truly desperate to provoke and who still had the discipline to lead with purpose. Lebanon is often viewed through the lens of size, of political instability, of economic hardship. It's the small country caught between storms, the one many underestimate in the grand chessboard of the Middle East. But when Israel launched its midnight strike and the world waited to see what would happen next, Lebanon reminded everyone that size has never been the measure of strength. What Lebanon showed was not just a reaction, it was a stance, quiet, unwavering readiness that said, we may be wounded, but we are not weak. We may be small in land, but not in legacy. And when it came time to speak, Lebanon didn't scream. It stood. It stood with dignity, with unity, and with resolve that shocked those who thought it would crumble. What makes Lebanon's response powerful isn't only in its military preparedness or the reach of its resistance, it's in the spirit of its people. A nation that has known war, invasion, political division, and economic collapse still found the will to stand on principle. It would have been easy to remain silent, to play it safe, to stay in the shadows and avoid escalation. But Lebanon didn't flinch. It didn't hide behind excuses or fear. It stepped forward, not recklessly, but righteously. Because in the moment of trial, when aggression tests your backbone, you don't rise with noise, you rise with purpose. And Lebanon, scarred as it may be, rose with purpose that night. The shock wasn't just in what Lebanon did. It was in the fact that it did it together. A country often portrayed as fractured stood in remarkable alignment when it mattered most. It didn't matter which faction, which party, or which sect you looked at, the collective voice was clear. Dignity matters. Borders matter. Our people matter. That unity, forged in the fire of shared history and constant external pressure, became Lebanon's loudest answer. Not in flashy retaliation, but in the power of presence. The kind of presence that says, we're here and we're not going anywhere. You can strike, you can threaten, but you cannot erase the will of a people who've survived more than bullets. Israel's strike aimed to intimidate, to remind the region of its reach. But what it did instead was spark a flame of resistance that reached further than expected. And Lebanon, often underestimated, became one of the brightest sparks in that fire, not because of destruction, but because of dignity. Not because of retaliation, but because of readiness. The message was simple, yet profound. This land may be small, but its soul is vast. His voice is firm. And in the face of violence, Lebanon didn't back down. It stood up, and the world took notice. When the missiles fell and the smoke began to settle, most expected more division, more fear, and more silence from those who had been targeted. But what happened instead was something no one saw coming. The midnight strike that was meant to isolate, intimidate, and weaken ended up becoming the very spark that brought old allies closer, ignited new understandings, and reminded everyone in the region that unity is not always built in peace. It's often forged in prayer. The attack didn't divide, it aligned. Iran and Lebanon, two nations different in size, structure, and situation, found their strength not in separation, but in solidarity. What conflict had tried to fracture, principle began to mend. Israel's strike was calculated. It aimed to exploit political cracks, stir internal tensions, and pressure its adversaries to respond chaotically. But instead of chaos, it encountered coordination. Instead of panic, it met poise. Iran and Lebanon didn't just respond as individual entities. They moved with a sense of shared purpose, shared pain, and shared destiny. And that's where the real shock came. Because when you expect a fragmented response and instead face a unified front, it exposes a truth you tried to bury, that the resistance isn't just one group, one border, or one ideology. It's a network of nations and people bound by a refusal to kneel. This kind of unity doesn't come from agreements signed on paper. It comes from the battlefield of dignity. It comes from years of surviving war, economic war, media war. It comes from burying the fallen, rebuilding homes, and watching the world turn its back, yet still choosing to rise together. What made this moment historic wasn't just the strategic alignment. It was the moral alignment. A decision, loud and clear from those under attack, that they would not just endure together, they would respond together with wisdom, with courage, and with readiness. The world saw that this wasn't just about one night. It was about decades of shared struggle finally being met with shared resistance. The midnight strike didn't silence, it amplified. It showed that no matter how hard certain powers try to divide, there are still bonds they cannot break. There are still people who, though different in many ways, will come together when one of them is attacked. That unity didn't come with fanfare. It came with quiet determination. It didn't come from leaders making promises. It came from a common heartbeat, pulsing louder than fear. And in that heartbeat, the region began to realize this isn't a moment of isolation. This is a movement of connection, of collective strength, and of a resistance that's only growing stronger. When Israel's midnight strike shook the ground, it wasn't just the targeted nations that took notice. It was the entire world. Governments, media outlets, intelligence agencies, and everyday people across continents turned their eyes to the Middle East, expecting a familiar script: condemnation, silence, or a retaliatory act that would be labeled aggression. But what unfolded didn't match the expected narrative, and for the first time in a long time, cracks began to appear in the carefully controlled storylines pushed by global powers. Iran and Lebanon didn't respond with uncontrolled fire. They responded with measured resolve, clarity of message, and a presence that couldn't be twisted into chaos. And that shift forced people to ask questions they were never encouraged to ask. The media, often quick to portray resistance as terrorism and defense as threat, struggled to maintain control of the narrative. Images surfaced, not of panic, but of people standing in solidarity, not of destruction, but of preparation, resilience, and unity. For many across the globe, it was the first time they saw the other side, not as aggressors, but as human beings refusing to be bullied. That vision, that truth, cracked the illusion that had been protected for years, that only one side had the right to speak, to act, to defend. In coffee shops, universities, and even within diplomatic circles, questions began to surface. Why is it that the ones who are bombed are always portrayed as the threat? Why is it that when a powerful state launches a strike, it's called a precaution, but when the oppressed respond, it's called provocation? That night changed something. Not because of the damage done, but because of the clarity it brought. The global audience, even those who were previously indifferent, saw something they couldn't unsee. That maybe the loudest voices in media weren't telling the whole story. The most powerful shift came not from governments, but from the people. Social media lit up with voices from every corner of the world demanding fairness, demanding context, demanding truth. Hashtags weren't just trends. They became digital protests. That's how deeply the moment resonated. The strike that was meant to assert power ended up revealing the imbalance in how that power is narrated. It reminded people that information, like warfare, can be weaponized, but not forever. Eventually, the truth finds its voice. The shock wasn't just in the missiles, it was in the realization that the world is waking up, that people are no longer content with one-sided stories, that more and more are beginning to question who the real aggressors are and who the real defenders of dignity have always been. And in that awakening lies a new kind of resistance, one not fought only with weapons, but with awareness. The strike tried to send a message of dominance, but it ended up broadcasting a louder message of exposure. The narrative is changing, and those who once controlled it are no longer the only ones holding the microphone. In the aftermath of Israel's midnight strike, with the world watching and tension hanging heavy in the air, a deeper truth began to emerge, one that had nothing to do with the firepower on display, and everything to do with what followed after the dust began to settle. Because when the skies quieted and the headlines moved on, the real question remained: who was still standing? Who was still unshaken? And that's where the true shock lived. Not in the explosions, but in the endurance. Not in the noise of war, but in the calm after it. Iran and Lebanon didn't respond with reckless rage. They responded with something more unsettling to those who attacked them. They responded with unwavering presence. They stayed standing, heads high, hearts intact, and strategy in hand. Strength isn't always measured in who fires first. Often it's in who can take the hit and still hold their ground. And that's what the world witnessed in those tense hours and days following the strike. Iran didn't scramble. Lebanon didn't fall apart. Instead, they projected a kind of strength that isn't loud, but lasts. It's a strength rooted in belief, in identity, in years of being tested and not breaking. That quiet resilience, that readiness to respond but not react, is what shook the observers most. Because anyone can light a fire, but very few can stand in it and not burn. The calculated calm, the composed posture, the refusal to be provoked into chaos, it sent a message more powerful than missiles ever could. It said, "We are not afraid. We are not new to this, and you cannot move us from our ground with fear alone." That kind of defiance isn't born in bunkers or built in boardrooms. It's shaped by history. It's passed down through generations that have seen occupation, war, sanctions, and betrayal, and still chosen dignity over submission. And when you watch a people who have nothing left to prove stand without blinking in the face of power, you realize you're not watching weakness. You're witnessing a different kind of strength. The shock wasn't that Iran and Lebanon survived. It was that they did so with such steadiness, that after everything they refused to let fear dictate their next step, that after being attacked, they didn't scatter, they stood together. And in doing so, they redefined what resistance looks like. It's not always about who hits back the hardest. Sometimes it's about who refuses to fall apart, who refuses to play the part assigned to them by their enemy. That's what the world saw and couldn't unsee. Because while some measure strength by the size of the army or the volume of their threats, real power is revealed in the aftermath, in the ones who endure, in the ones who remain composed when the pressure is at its peak, in the ones who say without words, "You can strike us, but you will never shake us." They thought the midnight strike would silence voices. They thought fear would scatter the hearts of nations. But instead, it awakened a deeper resolve. Because when the dust settled, the ones who were targeted were still standing calm, focused, and unshaken. Iran didn't respond with noise. Lebanon didn't reply with panic. They answered with something far more powerful: unity, patience, an unbreakable will. This wasn't a story of retaliation, it was a story of realization. The world saw through the smoke. The people began asking questions the media could no longer bury. And in that silence after the strike, something louder than bombs echoed across the world. You can strike, but you cannot break us. You can threaten, but you cannot erase us. And when you try to divide us, you only make us stronger. The real power wasn't in the missile. It was in the response. And that response told the world, we may bend, but we do not break. Thank you for staying till the end. May you walk forward with clarity in your heart, courage in your words, and strength in your convictions. Never let fear blind you from truth. Never let noise drown your soul. And when the world tries to shake you, stand firm, stand proud, and stand together. Good luck on your journey. And thank you for listening.